All right, so I'm kind of excited to have the opportunity to analyze a game with Dane today. And Dane showed me an interesting game that he thought would, be helpful to take a look at. And it's in the Scandinavian defense in the knight to f3 lines. And I've done some videos on model games in the Scandi, and Dane found this really interesting game that basically is a model game gone wrong, where black kind of goes down a critical book line and things kind of go awry. So I thought, Dane, real quickly I could do like a hyper accelerated introduction here to introduce you um, to the video. And Dane is a pretty humble guy, so I won't embarrass him talking about all his chess accomplishments. Um, but I would feel remiss if I didn't mention the fact that you've been a great ambassador for chess. So Dane has recently moved to Missouri, as many good chess players end up doing, but he played out of the Twin Ports Chess Club, which is in Duluth, Minnesota, and Superior, Wisconsin area for years and years. And his dad, Marv, actually ran the club there for decades. And I live in northern Wisconsin, and I was a couple hours away from the club, but I would try to make it up there, as much as I could, because it was a very inviting and very fun and strong chess club. And Dane, of course, was a big part of that, along with his father. And one thing that really kept my interest in chess was there was a Twin Ports Open that Dane would organize, along with some help from some other members of the Twin Ports Chess Club. And I have to say that was that was the best tournament ever. I looked forward to that every year, and I would be like almost angry if I was stuck working that weekend and couldn't get switched out of it. So basically, up until COVID, there was an annual tournament called the Twin Ports Open, and it was really awesome. There'd usually be like 100 players, and anybody watching this would probably recognize a lot of the names of people that would play in it. I know every year, if I can remember right, John Bartholomew played in it, and he'd often, would have something organized, like Dane would organize a simul by him or a lecture the day before the tournament started. Alex Yermolinsky, every time I was there, he was there, and he was gracious enough to take a buy or two, and then on his buy rounds, he would analyze club players' games. When you got done, you could take your game to him, and he would analyze it with you and give you advice. So, I mean, that was like a tremendous opportunity. And then there was like a laundry list of other names people would recognize. Brian Smith played in it every year. Andrew Tang played in it most years. Mauricio Flores Rios, he's the one that wrote that famous pawn structure book. The blindfold guy, Timur Garayev, and Ilya Nizhnik played in it. I mean, it would just be, a laundry list of like very strong players that people would recognize. But then also just in the amateur sections too was just very competitive and very fun, and it was just like a really fun environment. So that really was one of the things that inspired me to keep playing over the board chess, even when life kind of hit me with a lot of difficulties in a short period of time. So I just like I said, Dane's pretty humble, so I won't embarrass him with his chess accomplishments, but I did want to just mention that you've been a great ambassador for chess, and I really do appreciate that. So anyway, I guess we could get into the game here. What do you think, Dane? Go through the game quickly once, and then circle back and go through it in detail so people can kind of just get an idea of what we're going over here?
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah, thank you for the kind words, Brock. And regarding community development, I think it's also worth noting that as an improving adult player, it's encouraging to see all the YouTube videos that you're recording, you're sharing your progress, identifying setbacks, and giving what I think to be a realistic and an encouraging picture of what it means to be an adult improver. And I think this will be a pretty instructive game on several levels, because you've been discussing the Scandinavian as black. Mm-hmm. And if anyone's watched your videos, they already know that after Queen D or Knight C3, you're looking at queen d8. You mentioned John Bartholomew, one of our main supporters of the Twin Ports Open. And as you've noted in previous videos, John's an advocate of the Scandinavian, wrote an excellent online course advocating for the black side of the queen d8 Scandinavian. And just as a framework, because what we're going to see is completely different, is, in this queen d8 Scandinavian, just to get a position on the board, something like this, you've discussed a lot about the restraint structures and how resilient they are. And, you can really punch above your weight playing such a solid opening. And, you've shown great improvement as you've been documenting these videos. And I know in chess.com, you've had a pretty significant rating gain just by playing a lot of games and analyzing them. And the restraint structures have served you well so far. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I think is attractive for adult learners in particular is you don't have to pick up a second job, which is memorizing depressing opening lines, for hours, or else you'll get crushed, so to speak. And so that these restraint structures allow you to work more on understanding, gaining a sense of general ideas and sort of strategic awareness, as opposed to really concrete details, sink or swim. And if you miss one detail, the prodigy kid you're playing is going to defeat you in 15 moves or something. Mm-hmm. So that's the good news about playing the system. Now, after the move e4, e5, queen d5, how do you feel about the move which was played in the game? And by the way, I think white is 2,500. Black is master strength over 2,200. How do you feel when your opponent throws you a curveball with the move knight f3?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You mentioned that because I had found this really short, that's called the Simplest Scandinavian course by Alec Kolovich. And in that course, he recommends that you just play basically in these type of things. You play c6, and then you get your bishop out to f5, and then you play e6. And my understanding is with this knight to f3 move, one of our key fights, or one of our key trumps as the black player in the Scandinavian, is that when they play d4, and if they have played knight to c3, it becomes a little bit more difficult for them to protect d4, and we can put pressure on it. And it keeps them from being able to play c4 and getting, what do you call this, great center or whatever. And what I've found is interesting is I've actually had really good results just playing c6 here, bishop to f5, e6, letting them get d4 and c4 in, and just playing it like a restraint structure, since I'm not playing Kramnik or somebody who's going to make perfect use of this extra space. I actually kind of previously I reached an all-time high, winning a couple games like this, and I think drawing one against a decent player. And so I've done perfectly fine in that. But I also, one of the reasons I avoided this knight, playing the main line in this knight to f3 variation, which would be bishop to g4, and then castling queenside and really contesting the center, is that, like as an adult improver, I've never had the greatest memory per se. And I felt like I was just scared of concrete variations that would come up. Cause I haven't studied it in detail, but when I was flipping through some of the lines in the courses on it or the material on it, sometimes you play queen to f5, sometimes you play queen to a5, sometimes you play queen to d7, sometimes you got to throw in queen to e6 check, which we'll see in the game here. And I just felt like, well, for now, I was going to focus on learning the Slav in depth and play because this only comes up maybe 10 to 15% of the time, this knight to f3, I would just let them have their theoretical advantage by getting the d4, c4 kind of strong center in. But I have played this a handful of times, and I kind of looked, and surprisingly, I've scored well above my performance rating has been well above my actual rating in this. And I had played 10 games and I won 5, drew 2 and lost 3. So with black, that's really pretty good. So what I've come to notice is that at my level, the people I'm playing, they don't have all this concrete theory memorized, and they don't play the most testing lines where you feel like you'll get in trouble if you misstep on one of the concrete variations. So I was kind of excited when you sent this game to me, because my idea, wanted me to go through this game and take a look at it. And I feel like I gained a lot from doing that, because what I did is I tried to deconstruct it myself without referencing Chessable or an engine or anything like that, to see what I could learn from it, to see what I was so afraid of. And what's interesting is I think I learned quite a bit from it. I guess we'll find out. But I feel like, kind of a preview, Black kind of gets crushed in this game. But I feel like if I got crushed in some online games, but I learned as much as I did from this game, well, I think maybe switching to taking the bull by the horns and playing this mainline Scandi would be the way to go. And this morning I played a game where they didn't go down a main line, but I used some of the ideas from this setup to actually get a good position and win. And I got to an all-time high now on chess.com. So kind of excited to learn more about it, because I think it could be a very useful structure to play when white doesn't play aggressively.
Yeah, and that's a great point about that restraint structure setup that you can play, give white the opportunity to play d4 and c4, which is what knight f3 is all about, as you noted, delaying knight c3, the mainline variation, before playing d4 and c4. And so you've already come up with sort of a low maintenance solution that there's no real pressure that you must play bishop g4. But it's also, as you say, grabbing the bull by the horns. I think it's quite useful on several levels, in the sense that number one, this is an opening you can grow into. That you can gain a lot of experience playing these sharper lines within what's generally a fairly positional opening, the Scandinavian. And I think, as you noted, which is so important, is if you look at some of the online courses, they're forced to share some really concrete details, because everyone's running an engine and they don't want to look foolish, publishing faulty analysis. But then when you ask yourself, well, how often am I seeing these lines in my own practice? All of a sudden, you're not running into some of these concrete details as much as you would think. It's not to say that you can simply skate by and escape all concrete details in an opening. But on the other hand, I think it's fairly manageable, especially if we have the mindset as adult improvers that we're not competing in some sort of sprint race. We're looking at it as a marathon, and the only real competitors in the race, I would say, would be time with ourselves. And we don't have to race against anyone else. And as long as we have this growth mindset, as you said, there's a lot you can gain from these examples. And let's try this out in practice and see if our opponents can confidently ask some difficult questions, and whether we're able to then answer those questions, assuming they're asked in the first place. Mm-hmm. And as you noted, Brock, as we'll get rolling here with the moves, I think it's quite valuable that you find inspiration where it's like, okay, Magnus Carlsen's played the Scandinavian in a serious game and has won a game.
Dave Manson plays it over the board.
I've heard that. But on the record, I always play the French defense in case someone's listening to prepare. But no, yeah, you're right. I'm starting to play the Scandinavian too. And the lines we're going to look at, I've yet to face. Not to say that I won't face them and it won't be a challenge, but even in my practice and experience playing against masters, I'm not running into these lines too often. So let's take a look. So the whole idea is, we're playing bishop g4, putting white under pressure. And like I said, white's about 2,500 and black's over 2,200. So these are some strong players. Bishop e2 and knight c6, just like you were talking about. We're putting pressure against the knight, which is supporting some key central squares. And after d4, black castles. So we're putting a lot of pressure on the center. And like you said, in comparison to the main line where you play knight c3, white's move order does allow the possibility of playing c4. Now, my understanding, and admittedly it's somewhat limited regarding the concrete details up to this point, is to play queen f5 immediately. So I already learned something from this game, that queen a5 is also quite possible. And after bishop d2, now black plays queen f5. And you could say, okay, was it really necessary to play queen a5 first? Probably not necessary, but I think if we go back a move, maybe black's argument is that white has the opportunity to go wrong. For example, you might play something like knight c3. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden, black's setup makes perfect sense after bishop f3. And still in keeping with the fundamental theme of the Scandinavian is you lose time by moving your queen here and having to move it again, but you've opened the d file and d4 becomes a target, just like you said. So this is where all of a sudden knight takes d4 is in the air, and I'm not too happy as white. So in the game, after queen a5, bishop d2 is played, then queen f5, and then bishop e3, which we could have seen immediately if we played queen f5 first, and then bishop e3. And so this is where we get into a really concrete moment. That is, as black, you do need to know some lines. It's not just rely on understanding and positional judgment. This is where it gets a little bit sharp, is that the whole idea here for black is that we're allowing white to gain this generous central presence, but at a price, that we're going to counterattack quite vigorously, starting with the move bishop takes f3. So we're removing a key defender of d4. And after the move bishop takes f3, this is where the first sort of shock may occur to the system. Black needs to know this move. And of course, we're going to be covering some of these details, but we're also going to assume that the viewers are going to do some of their own research as well. But basically, there's one move here for black, and black has to really know what's going on. In the game, black played the only move, but it's a good one. Knight takes d4. And on the surface, this looks horrible. We're not going to spend too much time looking at all the variations. We're going to, go through the game fairly quickly, and then we can look at some of the finer details after. But I think it's just worth noting here that this looks crazy that a 2200 is playing knight d4. So basically, are they hanging their queen? And if we take a step back after each capture, it's important not to just look at this as a reactive move. Okay, the bishop recaptures the piece, and then we move on to our next plans. It's always useful to think, okay, what's changed in the position? Well, there's a contact point against our knight, but more importantly, bishop g4 is in the air. Mm-hmm. So knight d4 is not a move that you just play based upon general understanding, because obviously it looks like you're going to hang your queen. And we will just make a brief comment and then move on. But just the point is that after bishop g4, pinning the queen to the king, there's this concrete line where you have knight c2 check. And so the basic point is that if white decides to move the king, like on e2, for example, well, not only is the queen now hanging, as is the bishop with check. And if you move your king here, well, then you're losing your queen with check, and the pin goes away, right? Mm-hmm. So basically, white has to know exactly what they're doing, but we'll just stop at this point to say the queen would capture the knight, and then black would capture the bishop. So that's all we need to know for now, is just to say, okay, black didn't blunder the queen. Let's bookmark that as a note that maybe we need to know some more details later, but at least we understand that knight d4 isn't hanging the queen. So after knight d4, bishop takes d4 is played. And we are sensitive to the fact that bishop g4 is still a problem. It's not going away. Just because it was tactically solved for one move doesn't mean the entire idea has been refuted. You had mentioned, the queen moves to a variety of squares, and you said even queen e6. And in fact, like you said, in the game, this was played. So black plays queen e6 check as a way to disrupt the development. of white's king, and in general, just kingside development. And notice now, worst case scenario, if bishop g4 were played, now we at least have the resource f5. So that's one value to vacating the f5 square. So after the move bishop e2, the game continues with queen e4. Quite an interesting queen dance. And after castling, we reach a critical moment as we're transitioning out of the opening now into some very concrete sort of middle game plans. And the big question here is black is still down a piece temporarily, so we should probably regain this piece. And Brock, what were your impressions for black here with, you know, how you would proceed here if you were playing black? You know, how did you think about this position?
Yeah, well, when I got to this, I did remember enough from going through, you know, in the past, looking at the knight to f3 variations like this. I knew white's main idea here is to play queen to a4 and hit on a7 and try to cause all these problems on the back rank. And so when when black here, well, I shouldn't say what happened, but my instinct was to take with the queen, because then we've regained our material. We threaten an exchange of queens, which getting pieces off the board would favor us because we're a little bit behind in development, but we have the extra material. And my thought is if we can move the queen and still protect a7, you know, if we can take with the queen, still protect a7, get the queen off of e4, because my thought is at some point knight to c3 could be played, which would connect the rooks with tempo on the queen. And if you can imagine like a scenario where white's queen has made it to a7 and white is able to connect their rooks with tempo, that could get really nasty, like, you know, in combination with the d file, you know, getting a rook on d1 and threats of queen to a8. And it's just, I was when I first started playing chess back in high school, I was like I was a materialist, like when I was a real novice, and I would just grab any material I could and just try to hold on for dear life. So I have plenty of practical nightmare visions of positions like this where you got this pawn and all of a sudden all this stuff is activated with tempo, and all of a sudden you just find yourself in this quagmire you can't get out of.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what's important is creating a coherent narrative, you know, that makes sense to you. That maybe you don't remember the exact theory, but what you described makes great sense. Is we're behind in development, and it makes perfect sense to take with the queen, offer a trade of queens, and protect the sensitive a7 pawn at the same time. And as you noted, vacating e4 so knight c3 doesn't come with tempo. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, that you have a sense of direction or flow in the position. And the next move by black, and this is why I guess I didn't sort of complete that point earlier where I said it's one thing where you see Magnus Carlsen, you know, I think he defeated Caruana in the Queen D8 Scandi, if I remember correctly. No fault of the opening that he won, by the way. But in any event, it's nice to see those inspiring games. But sometimes we forget that before you're able to see those inspiring games, you're going to have a lot of battle scars. And that's, in my opinion, the best way to improve is just saying, you know, why can't I play the move I want? This particular move looks good. And I'm going to challenge my opponent to prove me wrong. And if we have that growth mindset and we're working on increasing just our overall understanding and just confidence in our chess, knowing, hey, we're going to miss some things. We're going to have our fair share of blunders, but I'm in it for the long haul. Then you can tolerate some of these at times painful defeats, because I think they produce just such a wealth of resources and wonderful lessons upon which to build. So black is looking at this position, and maybe he's already forgotten his theory. That's possible. Or maybe he just looks at the position and says, yeah, I can trade queens. That's the safe way to go. But why don't I keep attacking, capture with the rook, and white cannot move the queen. you mentioned queen a4, right? Well, it would seem that white can't do that because then the bishop would hang. So you look that far and say, well, if the queen can't move, then what does white play? And there's, I think, even a grandmaster game where black played rook d4, which turns out to be a big mistake. And then maybe white responded with knight d2 or something, right? And so you're absolutely right that queen d4 is the way to go, but rook d4 looks quite good. And I said something that if you're able to remove from your chess vocabulary, I think you instantly become a stronger player, which I said, you know, the queen can't move. If you remove sort of absolute language from your chess vocabulary, I can't or I must, you'll instantly become a stronger player. But you say, well, is that so? My initial impression is they cannot move the queen because then the bishop falls. Well, as you know, the 2500 certainly doesn't have can't and must in his chess vocabulary and says, okay, well, enjoy yourself. Queen a4. I'd have to imagine this game is quite a shock, you know, from black's perspective. And, you know, black says, okay, well, I understand you're attacking my pawn. We should also note queen e8's a possibility, but thankfully we do have the rook here able to block. So he says, all right, prove it. This is how I understood the position. My claim is you can't move your queen because I'm winning a piece, and you're countering my claim. Well, prove it. Prove that you're correct. And if you are correct, what a great lesson. And thankfully, because of this lesson here, you and I are sharing this game with others, you know? And so white takes the pawn, and all of a sudden, this position gets really complicated because now not only have I captured the pawn, I'm threatening the rook on d4. And one big warning, I think, for Scandinavian players or would-be Scandinavian players, when you have enough time in the restraint structures, which we introduced, you almost feel just immune from dangerous attacks, meaning, yeah, I'll be attacked, but I trust my restraint structure. And even though I'm behind in development, I don't see a clear way white's going to blow me out of the water. And sometimes you lose your sense of danger. And in these knight f3 with the quick d4 and c4 ideas, you know, you're not in Kansas anymore. You're not in the restraint structure anymore. And it turns out having a slumbering kingside is a big deal. So even though you're down, you're up a piece, the kingside is already, or the queenside, excuse me, is in serious trouble. And this is a very difficult position to defend. Now, you talked about being a materialist, and, well, you're in good company. You know, Yasser Seirawan proudly calls himself a pawn grubber and likes to grab pawns. But if, for example, we captured the pawn here, which gains a pawn, defends the rook, it turns out there's this powerful resource, knight a3. So the rooks are connected like you were forecasting in the other line. The knight may pay a visit to the b5 square, and with the rook now being open, it's not just losing a pawn, you're opening up a file for your pieces. This is going to be a nightmare for black. And so black avoided it for this reason. So the game continues, and we're going to see it end pretty quickly, Brock, is basically black's analysis is I'm just going all in on the attack. You know, if you complete development and start attacking my king, I'm going to be in trouble. So he plays the move rook g4. You know, white calmly puts the question to the rook with h3. Black steps back with rook g6. And now white or black has to pay the price. That, yes, you're up a piece, but with your slumbering king side and weak king, I'm going to expose some of the drawbacks to your position. So the king is smoked out into the center of the board. And now white just plays this calm move, just like you said, knight c3. Gains a tempo against the queen, connects the rooks. This almost feels like a Paul Morphy game, you know, just with the rapid development and weak enemy king. And after queen takes b2, attacking the knight, white doesn't blink, just continues to assault the enemy king. And I don't know how you would feel, Brock, as black here. You might be comfortable moving your queen into the center early in the Scandinavian. How do you feel about doing the same with your king after knight b5, rook takes? So black tries to shelter the king, but it's short lived, right? With knight b5, and then now you are allowed to make your confident centralizing move with your king, king e6.
It's a fighting piece.
Yes. And unfortunately, from Black's standpoint, this is a trip that is only a one-way ticket. There's no return. The king moves to f6, and then we see queen takes f8, regains some material, and this game is going to fall apart quite quickly. After the move e6, another shock to the system. Viewers are encouraged, if they'd like, to pause the video, try to figure out what they would play here. After some reflection, White plays this crushing move, knight takes e6. It's like, White was worried. Like, I want you to still be up a piece here. I'm sorry that I captured your bishop, so let me return this piece for you. But the beauty of this line, though, Brock, is that it looks complicated, but basically the way that I think White calculated this was, well, the pawn is pinned. So the only line that Black or White would have to calculate here is the king capturing. And the interested viewer can certainly, take a look at this independently. But the main point is you play queen d6 check, force the king up the board, and then follow that up with rook d5. And that king is running out of room and is going to be greeted by some enthusiastic enemy pawns with the queen and rook. So the knight can't be captured without some horrible consequences. So Black just tries to hang on with queen e2, attacking the knight and the rook, and then rook d6. Really nice move, protecting the knight, and the king isn't exactly too thrilled about its prospects at this point. We see a check, king h2. And what's really funny here, Brock, knight h6 is played, but when I was analyzing this game, I thought, I would probably think about this move, at least a spite check, and try to make White a little bit nervous. But not only is f4 good enough, there's this beautiful reply, knight f4 check. And so now all of a sudden the king is in trouble. And if the king moves up to the 5th rank, you have to start thinking about moves like rook d5. But back to the game, after king h2, so there's a queen e1 check, king h2, the desperate knight h6 was played, and knight d4 provoked resignation. Not flinching about material here. Ooh, I have to take this rook. No, not at all. I'm going to play knight d4. And one sample line here is basically wherever the king moves. If you move here, you certainly have to think about a fork. I'm sure there's other strong moves there as well. And if you play something like, say, king g5, then there's queen g7 check. Let's say the king moves to f4. Queen g3 check, king e4 check. The king moves here, and it just feels fitting, that the king makes it right to the center. And then we see rook d5 mate. So quite a picturesque end to the game, I have to say. What are some of your sort of observations about the game and just sort of conclusions from this experience?
Yeah, well, like I mentioned in the beginning, I used to feel just like completely overwhelmed by positions like this, just in the sense that I don't want to have to try to memorize stuff, and there's all these different places the queen can go, but just kind of stepping back and slowing down and just taking my time to deconstruct the game, and I feel like, in combination of what I previously kind of observed in these lines when I went through them initially some time back, and was kind of too afraid to employ him full time, and so I went to kind of like the easier method. I think like I understanding the queen to a4 to a7 motif for white here, I can totally see how if I wasn't aware of that, you could be tempted to do rook takes knight instead of, or you could be tempted to capture with the queen instead of or with the rook instead of the queen, bishop here on d4. But like knowing that, now it makes more sense as I go through it. So it's like one less kind of thing that doesn't seem weird or whatever. And what's interesting is I started going through some lines in Bartholomew's Chessable course after analyzing this game, and I feel like I'm able to pick up some of the key ideas better. Like, it doesn't come up in this game, but sometimes these situations, where you get this stuff where your a7 pawn becomes weak, you end up putting your queen on e5 so that you can play like e6 and get your bishop to d6, and kind of, you gain a tempo with the mate threat on h2. And there's these kind of things that actually start to make sense, that if you were just like repetitively clicking through the course, you think, oh my God, how am I going to memorize all this? But when you realize you're in this position, like you were saying, I think it's a very good observation that we're so used to playing in these restraint structures that we feel like it's so resilient that we don't have to defend perfectly, and we're not going to run across people that are that patient with an attack that they're going to exploit it. Well, in this position, you had an open, you had open central for white. They didn't have an E or D pawn on the board. And for black, there was just an E pawn. So it's almost, you're like in an open position and behind on development, and that's a completely different beast. And that's why you get this fearful sense in the beginning. But once you kind of recognize the key points that you actually do need to be afraid of, it's not that hard to like understand the solutions to it once you understand the problem. And I think you can't like understand the problem. Well, you could if like a different level player than me may, but for me, you can't understand the problem until you've seen it, a normal play go up in flames, and then you figure out, well, what happened and why. And when you have that why, then you can try to figure out the solutions, and then it makes more sense. So yeah, it's pretty cool. I'm glad you were kind enough to send me that game, and I appreciate your help over the years on stuff like this. It's because I would never think of approaching that. I do try to like deconstruct my own games, but this probably gives me like courage to like say, okay, well, I'm gonna play these lines, online, and I'm gonna if I get smashed, I'm gonna learn a lesson out of it, and then I can go back to the course and actually understand why some of these things are made, and then I actually can remember it. I hope. Time will tell, but like I'm kind of excited about it.
Yeah, and if you don't mind, Brock, I was thinking I would just, as brief as I can be when I say briefly, highlight a couple of directions and to give some examples of what you're talking about in the sense of working on, gaining more confidence in this system and basically where are we likely going to encounter some resistance. Even when we look at a line, we gain a better understanding of what not to do, which can sometimes help us figure out what we should do, right? But I just wanted to mention, walking through this line just one more time. So bishop g4, bishop e2, knight c6. So we're talking about basically if white plays passively, you're castling and you're playing e5. And this can be really nice for black.
Yep.
And if white castles kingside, it's not out of the question to even start lighting some fiery arrows toward the king.
And I think this is one reason why my actual score in this, even though I don't have all these lines memorized, has been tremendous. My performance rating in these, it's because a lot of people just let me get in e5, and then that's just like a dream position. Exactly. Or at least it's like we're having all the fun. So certainly not to cut you off, but I do think like club players will be able to get that e5 move in a lot, and then like d5 is just or d4. I mean, it's just a horrible square for white. Like it's just going to take a lot for them to untangle.
But that's such an excellent point. I'm glad you brought it up, because you're not facing a 2,500.
Right.
You're not playing against Stockfish, or at least hopefully you're not. So when you're playing other humans that are, improving amateurs, they're not likely, spending, say, their evenings memorizing all these lines. And even if they do, there's still plenty of opportunity to fight and ask some practical questions. So yeah, like you said, assuming we get there, right? Mm-hmm. So, okay, we're assuming White's booked up, knows these moves. One thing I learned, by the way, and the reason I wanted to show this was just Queen F5 is the move you mentioned as sort of the most popular and direct choice, and it makes sense to play it. But sometimes what's useful is to say, well, in this game, Queen A5 was played. Why didn't White or Black play this way? Meaning, why didn't Black play the way that I would play, which is Queen F5? And one answer might be there's this extra move D5. And what's funny about it is the bishop, you would say, is maybe misplaced on D2, but by blocking the queen, it actually helps resolve a potential pin. So one thing I recommend, no matter what opening you're working on, is when you have an impression that this is the path I want to follow, and in the game something else is played, try to compare those slight differences and see if you can find a sensible narrative to explain it, because it helps make your move a bit more memorable and also what to look out for. So instead of throwing in this check, which I think is fine, Queen F5 seems to be a simpler solution. And notice now, Brock, there's no real threat of D5 because I can play E6, right? And that's actually nice that the bishop isn't on D2. So that's one thing I learned by looking at these slight differences. After bishop E3, this is the one concrete line to really know, is you take the knight and you play knight takes D4. And a big mistake that can happen is after bishop, I'm looking at the actual line, not what was played in the game. So it was taking me off the thread. So in the game, this happened, right? But we look at Queen F5 first. Now we take, and after knight takes D4, what's so important here is after the bishop captures, that fear of being down material is to worry about E5 or C5 or something and then forget about this tactic. Mm-hmm. So when you're reviewing this game, it's so important to say, why is knight takes D4 possible? Why am I not losing my queen? And then you'll check out the details after knight C2. And once you're confident, go through it a few times at least, you can march forward with your own ideas. And now, because of this bishop G4 idea, we throw in the check. And worst case scenario, if the king moves or something, now all of a sudden you have some moves, including just queen C4 check. Mm-hmm. So it's also important to ask yourself, well, what if they don't go according to script? Why do they have to play this move? Well, they don't, but there's consequences to it. Mm-hmm. Right. And then the last thing I wanted to share, I don't want to make the video too long, but I just hope it's worth adding a couple of extra details here, is that not only after queen E4 do we have some interesting play, C5 is possible, worth keeping in mind. But the big thing I want to remind people is that after castles, your point about taking with the queen is essential. We learned that, we can't get overly confident because all of our moves so far are so active, right? Bishop G4, knight C6, I'm sacking a knight. I get really excited. So as you get excited with that momentum, it's so easy to want to continue to attack. But we have to remember we're not in the restraint structure anymore. So after trading the queen, the one thing I want to leave everyone with is that queen A4 is a really concrete move. And this would be worth taking a moment, asking yourself, rather than looking at the course, rather than turning on the engine, what move occurs to you, say, in a bullet game? Not that I recommend playing bullet chess, but if you look at a move, what is your immediate instinct? Is it to take this pawn and threaten the rook? Maybe, maybe not. But if it is, that's worth critically understanding, why isn't this being recommended? Why can't I take this pawn and threaten the rook? And one answer goes back to lack of development, and you're opening up a line to your own king. is a move like knight a3, we saw that earlier, continues to haunt us, that we're helping white continue the attack. And even though it appears that our bishop is hanging as white, well, good luck surviving this attack. You know, and so in any event, we're obviously not going to go through all the lines now, but the main point is just continue to resurface. It can be overwhelming, even going through this video, seeing all these moves we're talking about, and just try to learn when you're playing a game, you know, one new detail or studying a game, something you didn't know before. Ask a question and answer it to the point where you feel confident, like, yeah, I've got this. I can actually explain this well. Like, why can't I take the pawn on b2? And if we're looking at it rather than the sprint or the fast food chess solutions, you know, we're taking a slower approach, you know, you're going to understand these positions better. And a move like e6 can make some sense. And the final thing I wanted to really stress here is after the move knight c6 or knight c3, we're a little worried about our queen. Maybe you'd move your queen back to b6, which is worth exploring. But the main line is a6. And by asking that question earlier, why can't I capture that pawn on b2? And we were able to highlight knight a3 to b5. Well, that starts to make some sense why you might want to play a6. And maybe it's not quite a restraint structure, but at least we see some familiar signs. Mm-hmm. And in this position, by playing a6, here's the big question I want to ask you, Brock. If you have 1 second to make a move after rook d1, attacking your queen and x-raying your rook on d8, like, what would be your 1 second move?
Well, if I hadn't gone through because I kind of know the answer already because I kind of studied this stuff, but I would be tempted just to play like queen to c5 probably.
Yep. And my thought would be queen f6 or h4 as well, from the standpoint of defending the rook. And yeah, like you said, we could play a move like queen c5. And one line that I threw in there was, say, guard the rook, so that after you trade the rooks, you can take with the queen. And what's amazing here, Brock, is after rook d1, our queen is being attacked. If we try to block and dare to develop another piece other than our queen, you're going to run into c5.
Yep.
So let's say you play here, and incredibly, there's this move c5. Kind of a shocking move. But all of a sudden, it's like, well, if I play queen c5, what's going on after queen e8? Mate.
Checkmate, yep.
Not good. And if I play a move, if I say, okay, it's a trap. I'm not going to fall for it. I'm not going to get mated. Maybe he wants to play c6 here, so I'll play c6. Well, we'll be in for a rude awakening after the move bishop takes a6. Mm-hmm. And we can look at those details later, but what my point is like you said, you've studied it, so you know the move is queen e5. But if you didn't study this line, maybe you play queen c5, or I said queen f6 or queen h4, and you're going to get destroyed if you get to this point, which is quite an assumption that your opponent knows all of this, because we always think about our shortcomings and somehow forget the struggle on the other side of the board. Our opponent is also going to have some doubt here.
Right, and especially at my level, not so much at yours, but at my level, if I am facing an opponent who has all this memorized against the Scandinavian, which is going to be pretty low on their things to memorize, they probably have some major weaknesses if they're at my rating and they have all that memorized. So, you know, they may not even win it from this position here. They may not find queen to e8 mate or something. So
exactly. And so the last thing here to emphasize is whether you play queen c5 or queen f6 is the reason queen e5 is the move, like the only move to stay afloat, is you allow the opponent to expose your king. But if they decide to check you, it turns out you have other pieces on the board. And that's what you said earlier about bishop d6 gaining a tempo. And then our king might find shelter on e7. Mm-hmm. And so my point is that this is all overwhelming. Even you and I discussing it, it's a lot to take in. But if you look at it from the standpoint of figuring out what not to do and why are certain natural moves not working. Well, when you're playing the Scandinavian, the price of admission is you're going to fall behind in development. And when you're playing against this curveball, knight f3, it's not the fastball pitch that you're used to where you get the restraint structure. Time becomes essential. And so that's where you have to work out these concrete details, not the first, second, or third time you look at it. Mm-hmm. You have to just stick with it and continue to learn from these examples where now you're saying, yeah, I know the move's queen e5. Mm-hmm. Right. So anyway, sorry to kind of stretch out the video, but I just thought it was worth adding this analysis just as a reminder that there's layers and layers of this stuff and it can feel overwhelming. And the main point is just take the long range attitude. You can grow into these systems. And as Brock noted, if you're not feeling it, you're tired, you're groggy, you're working all day, there's other ways to play. Bishop f5, restraint structure. And yeah, white gets a little more space, but life continues. But I personally feel excited to learn more of these details and why, as black, I'm able to hold the balance in a position that feels a little frightening at first glance. But I think that'll go in two directions if we are confident and willing to take a couple hits along the way.
Yeah, and I would say, like, to people that were kind of had the same trepidation I did, just try it out and see what happens. Like, I couldn't believe the statistics when I pulled it up. But like, my performance rating was over 100 points better than like my actual rating playing these against these knight to f3, and that was just a real quick cursory wing through like a chessable course, and not actually after having deconstructed and gotten a better understanding of these positions. So, up until a very high level, you're going to get as many easy victories out of this as white's going to get on you. So I don't know. It's kind of fun, and that's me playing it, who my natural strength is not attacking or, playing with the initiative or, like, I'm still at the level where it's, like, tempo is important, and I don't fully, I don't take full value of the element of time in chess yet. Like, I'm still at that level. So, and I'm having okay results, and I'm not facing people that are, reeling off all this theory. And, so thanks. I appreciate it, Dan. It's very helpful. And I do appreciate all your help over the years. You're very gracious with your time, and it's inspiring. And like I said, you've held off some strong players with the Scandi, and John Bartholomew has done fine with it. So I'll never reach the level where I'm going to be real tested. The theoretical limits of the Scandi. So it's kind of fun to have something to play and just slowly learn more about it.
Yeah, and just enjoy the journey, and take it at your own pace. And thanks again for having me. And I just think this is a really inspiring work that you're doing, because it's just a good reminder, that improvement is possible without, having to be booked up 40 moves deep in a Najdorf or a Marshall Gambit or something. And if you like those openings, that's great.
When you're in your upper 40s like I am, that's just not something you want to be doing. Like, I mean, even if a person could, is that how you want to be spending your time? So, but because like these positions here, I mean, how much more fascinating can you get than say this game here, or just kind of breaking down this position? You don't have to be playing the Najdorf to get something fascinating to learn from and enjoy. So, yeah, thanks so much, Dane. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks again, and good luck to all of you that may feel bold enough to advance the D pawn 2 squares in response to E4.
Yeah, cool. All right, have a good one.
Yeah, we'll see you.